Alice Carter has built a life of success and solitude, carefully keeping the world at arm's length. At 36, she lives in the quiet house she once shared with her ex-husband, her days filled with work and evenings spent avoiding the neighbours she has no intention of knowing. A lifetime of loss has shaped her. The death of her father at 10, a mother who moved on to start a new family, and the loving aunt who raised her, only to pass away a decade ago. Her marriage crumbled under the weight of everything they've lost, and since then she's chosen isolation over vulnerability. But when Alice's reclusive neighbour, Ethan Brooks, unexpectedly becomes the guardian of his young niece after a family tragedy, Alice's carefully constructed walls begin to crack. As her assumptions about Ethan are challenged and her heart warms to the little girl's innocence, Alice finds herself drawn into their world, a world that forces her to confront her fears, her grief, and her capacity to love again. Together, they discover that healing can come from the most unexpected places, and that family isn't defined by blood, but by the love we choose to give. Early mornings in Alice's neighbourhood were a well-rehearsed symphony. The low growl of Ethan Brooks' car as he pulled out of his driveway, the steady click of heels from the woman across the street walking her dog, and the hushed rhythm of joggers exchanging snippets of conversation. It all played out like clockwork. On the surface it was perfection, lawns trimmed to sharp angles, flower beds brimming with blooms that refused to wilt, and sunlight catching on car windows like a wink from the universe. But for Alice Carter, mornings weren't about perfection. They were an uneasy truce, moments balanced on the edge of memory, a past she'd buried but couldn't quite forget. Alice dreamed of a song. It was soft, lilting, and achingly familiar, drifting through her mind like sunlight slipping through heavy curtains. When I wake up, I see my sunshine, warming my heart. Every day you're mine. The world feels brighter with you in view. Oh, my little sunshine, it's all because of you. Her aunt's voice wove through the melody, gentle, warm, and brimming with love. It was the song that had greeted her every morning as a child, wrapped in the scent of pancakes and the comforting creak of the kitchen floor. Even in the safety of her dreams, the memory carried a quiet ache. The song belonged to a time when life had felt safe, her aunt's presence a sanctuary after everything else had crumbled. Alice opened her eyes, the melody still echoing faintly before dissolving into the quiet of the room. It left behind a hollow ache, one she didn't need to name. She knew it too well. It had been 10 years since her aunt passed, but the memories still crept in, stealing moments when her guard was down. She sat up slowly, her gaze brushing over the familiar walls. This house had once held all her hopes for the future, a family, laughter, love. Now it held only her, and the kind of silence that had learned to stay. The growl of an engine outside jolted her back to the present. Ethan Brooks. Handsome, charming, and insufferably confident, he had a way of drawing attention she had no intention of giving. Alice avoided Ethan like she avoided all her neighbours. Small talk was a minefield she'd rather not navigate, and letting people in. That was a risk she wasn't willing to take. But Ethan was hard to ignore. Lavishly handsome and frustratingly polite, he was the type who made an impression without even trying. And then there were the women, always a new face leaving his house in the early hours, all with the same dazed, enchanted look. Alice often caught herself watching from the kitchen window, curiosity nagging at the edges of her detachment, Were they charmed by his looks, his confidence, or was it something more? She told herself it didn't matter, and most days it didn't. But there were moments, fleeting, traitorous moments, when she wondered what it might feel like to move through life with that kind of ease, that kind of warmth. The song from her dream had already dissolved into the ether by the time she poured her coffee, its melody replaced by the hum of the espresso machine. She moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, her tailored blazer and heels as much a part of her defense as the walls she kept firmly in place. Work was her fortress. Within its glass and steel confines, she was valued for her sharp mind and unparalleled focus. Alice didn't linger in the grey spaces of casual chatter or shared laughter. She didn't need to. Twice, rival firms had tried to lure her away, but her company always found a way to keep her. They weren't about to lose their secret weapon. Everyone knew where they stood with Alice Carter. No personal questions, no idle conversation. She wasn't rude, just precise, like a scalpel cutting through unnecessary pleasantries. It wasn't long before the nickname had surfaced, whispered near the coffee machine, and muttered in the elevator, "The Ice Queen." She hadn't flinched when she overheard it. In fact, she welcomed it. It freed her from expectations she had no interest in meeting and saved her the effort of pretending to care. The title fit as neatly as the blazer she fastened over her shoulders before stepping into the day. Before leaving, Alice crouched by the counter and tipped cat food into a small ceramic bowl. The faint clink echoed in the stillness of the house. "Breakfast, Willow," she murmured, knowing the cat wouldn't appear. Willow, a sleek black shadow with piercing green eyes, had always been elusive. In the mornings, she slipped out through the pet door before Alice even stirred. Their arrangement was wordless but mutual. Minimal interaction, maximum independence. Alice had found her during a storm, shivering on the back porch like something fragile, yet defiant. Taking her in hadn't been an act of sentimentality. Willow had reminded Alice of herself, wary, self-reliant, and entirely uninterested in attention. They existed together without expectation. Willow moved through the house like a ghost, slipping into shadows and emerging only when it suited her. It was an unspoken understanding. Solitude was their sanctuary. Alice stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against her skin as her heels clicked softly on the stone path to the driveway. She glanced instinctively toward the house next door. And there she was, Mrs. Wainwright, armed with a watering can and that ever-present air of cheerful determination. "Alice, dear," the older woman called, her voice carrying across the hedge like a bird's chirp. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" Alice hesitated, the polite smile already forming on her lips. It was automatic, her first layer of defense. "Morning," she replied, keeping her steps brisk. If she moved fast enough, she could avoid. "Oh, hold on a moment." Mrs. Wainwright waved her watering can, leaning over the fence with an enthusiasm that could bend metal. "You'll never guess. Emmett got a part in the school play. He's going to be a tree. Isn't that just the sweetest thing?" Alice paused mid-step, the effort to look interested like pulling teeth. "That's nice." "It is, isn't it? He's just thrilled," Mrs. Wainwright continued, undeterred. "And Abigail's birthday party last weekend. Oh, I meant to tell you. She got the most adorable little dollhouse." Alice's stomach tightened. It wasn't that she hated the stories. She hated the ache they left behind. Tales of grandchildren and family celebrations were a language she didn't understand, a life she couldn't share. That's wonderful, Mrs. Wainwright, Alice interrupted gently, edging closer to her car. But I really have to get to work. Deadlines. Of course, dear, of course. Mrs. Wainwright smiled, not the least offended. You're such a busy bee, aren't you? Always on the go. Alice nodded quickly, sliding into her car with a muted sense of relief. Mrs. Wainwright's voice lingered faintly as Alice pulled the door shut, a soft hum of cheer against the quiet of her own thoughts. She eased the car down the driveway, her gaze firmly forward. The morning stillness of the neighbourhood wrapped around her like a cocoon, insulating her from the warmth she couldn't quite bear to touch. As Alice backed out of the driveway, she caught a glimpse of Ethan's house in her rearview mirror. The blinds were still drawn, and his car sat unmoving in the driveway, a rare stillness for someone who always seemed to be in motion. She frowned slightly, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her usual detachment. But it passed quickly. She didn't know Ethan well enough to wonder, and even if she did, curiosity wasn't a luxury she indulged. Work was her fortress, the place where everything had its place. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, ready to bury herself in the structure of it. Alice's life was a series of well-maintained compartments: home, work, and the space in between where she kept the world at arm's length. It was a system that had served her well, until it hadn't. As she turned onto the main road, the faint echo of a song crept back into her mind, soft and bittersweet, like the shadow of a life she'd long since abandoned. She caught her breath, her grip tightening. The melody lingered for a moment longer, teasing the edges of her resolve, before she forced it back into the quiet corners where she kept things she didn't have the strength to confront. The day ahead loomed, structured and predictable, just the way she needed it. But the songs stayed with her, a reminder that the past had a way of bleeding into the present, no matter how hard she tried to keep them apart. Alice's day at the law firm had been predictably productive. A mountain of contracts reviewed, a tense negotiation handled with practiced ease, and not a single interaction that strayed beyond polite nods and clipped emails. By the time she pulled into her driveway that evening, the streetlights were flickering on, casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the concrete as her thoughts wandered toward dinner and the report waiting on her desk. But as she closed the car door, something in Ethan's yard caught her eye. Alice glanced toward his house, half out of habit, half curiosity she wouldn't admit to. But this time, she froze. There, on the front lawn, was a little girl, no older than 4, skipping in uneven circles, clutching a stuffed rabbit in her small hands. Her dark curls bounced with each step, her giggles rising into the cool evening air. Ethan stood nearby, his hands in his pockets, a faint smile softening his usual air of confidence. But it wasn't just him. Beside him stood a woman, her long blonde hair glowing under the streetlights as she leaned down to adjust the little girl's coat. Alice's chest tightened, her thoughts quick and sharp, cutting through the moment like glass. It didn't take much to connect the dots. The little girl's dark curls, the woman's warm smile, Ethan's casual stance. It was obvious. He'd gotten her pregnant. The thought hit Alice like a slap, swift and stinging. A flicker of anger sparked in her chest, bitter and unwelcome. How effortless it must be for him, she thought. How simple to stumble into parenthood, probably without even meaning to. The little girl squealed as the woman took her hand, leading her toward a car parked by the curb. Ethan followed, his hands still in his pockets, his smile faint but steady. Alice stood rooted in place, watching them leave as the ache in her chest grew sharper, more familiar. She didn't notice the way her grip tightened on her bag or the quickened pace of her steps toward her front door. All she could feel was the sting of it all, how she had wanted so desperately for something like that, and how it had been taken from her before it even began. Alice frowned at the knock on her door, setting her mug down with a reluctant sigh. Visitors were rare, and she liked it that way. Her home was her haven, a place where she could control what and who entered her life. But when she opened the door, she froze. Standing on the porch was the blonde woman from the night before, the one who had stood beside Ethan, adjusting the little girl's coat. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her tone polite but clipped, the kind of professionalism that made Alice instinctively straighten. "I'm looking for someone who might know Ethan Brooks, your neighbour." Alice blinked, her thoughts colliding with the assumptions she'd pieced together the night before. The woman held a clipboard, the official air of it unravelling the image Alice had painted in her mind. I know who he is," Alice replied cautiously. Her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the door. "Why do you ask?" The woman shifted her weight, glancing at the clipboard as though searching for the right words. "I'm with Family Services. Ethan is applying for full guardianship of his niece, Lily. I'm speaking to neighbours to see if they can vouch for him or provide any insight." The words landed like a sudden gust of wind, leaving Alice momentarily unsteady. Family Services? Guardianship? "He's trying to adopt her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, her expression softening, the hard edges of professionalism easing into something more personal. Her parents, his brother and sister-in-law, died in a car accident a few months ago. He's been fighting to keep her ever since. Alice's mouth opened, but no words came out. She could still see the little girl in her mind's eye, the way her dark curls had bounced, her laughter ringing out like music in the cool night air. Every assumption she'd made about Ethan and the blonde woman crumbled, sinking fast under the weight of the truth. "Oh," Alice finally managed, her voice thin, the word insufficient for the storm of thoughts rushing through her mind. The woman offered a small, understanding smile, as though she had seen this reaction many times before. "It's a big adjustment for him, I'm sure, but he seems devoted to her." Alice nodded absently, her gaze drifting over the woman's shoulder toward Ethan's house. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow over the front lawn. The woman shifted her clipboard, her tone turning brisk again. "Well, thank you for your time. If anything comes to mind, you can contact us here." She handed Alice a card with the agency's logo and contact details. "Of course," Alice murmured, tucking the card into her palm. The woman gave a polite nod before turning to leave, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. Alice closed the door slowly, her grip tightening around the card. The house felt quieter than usual, the weight of the encounter pressing against the walls. She stood there for a moment, staring blankly at the card in her hand, as the image of Lily's laughter and Ethan's quiet smile refused to fade. Alice rinsed her mug, her thoughts still circling the conversation with Family Services, when the sound of Mrs. Wainwright's voice cut through the quiet. "Alice, dear." Alice froze, her gaze darting to the front door. Sure enough, Mrs. Wainwright stood just beyond the small gate that separated Alice's front garden from the sidewalk, holding a basket of flowers. Alice hesitated before stepping out, the polite mask firmly in place. "Good evening, Mrs. Wainwright." "Oh, it's a lovely one, isn't it?" Mrs. Wainwright beamed, stepping closer. "I just wanted to drop off these dahlias, last of the season, you know. Thought they'd cheer up your kitchen." "Thank you," Alice said, taking the basket. She glanced toward the street, hoping that would be the end of it, but Mrs. Wainwright lingered. "And can you believe it?" Mrs. Wainwright continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "That Ethan Brooks, taking in his little niece like that, such a fine young man, after everything he's been through." Her expression softened, her tone laced with sympathy. Alice's grip on the basket tightened. "I wouldn't know," she said carefully. Mrs. Wainwright sighed, shaking her head. Losing his brother and sister-in-law like that, it's more than anyone should have to bear. And now, raising Lily all on his own, it's a lot for one man, don't you think? The words stirred something Alice didn't want to feel. She had been 10 when her father died, and she could still remember the ache of an empty chair at the dinner table. Worse than the loss itself had been what followed, her mother's grief turning brittle and distant, until one day she had packed her things and left to start a new family. Her aunt had stepped in, holding Alice together when everything else had fallen apart. But even her aunt couldn't erase the memory of those promises. "We'll visit," her mother had said. "We'll still be a family." And maybe she had meant it, but meaning it didn't make it better. Her mother had moved on, had started fresh, had children who didn't carry the weight of grief in their eyes. Alice knew that wasn't a betrayal, not really. But it still felt like one. And no matter how much her aunt had loved her, a part of Alice had always wondered why she wasn't enough to make her mother stay. Alice forced the memory away, locking it behind the walls she had perfected over the years. "I suppose," she said stiffly. Before Mrs. Wainwright could respond, the crunch of footsteps approached. Both women turned to see Ethan coming down the street, his hands in his pockets, and his shoulders slightly hunched. "Ah, speak of the devil!" Mrs. Wainwright exclaimed, waving him over. "Ethan, dear, come say hello to Alice. I was just telling her what a wonderful thing you're doing for that sweet little girl." Ethan slowed, his expression neutral as his gaze flicked to Alice. "Hi," he said simply, his tone polite but distant. "Hi," Alice replied, her grip tightening on the basket. "You must be so proud of yourself," Mrs. Wainwright gushed, stepping closer to Ethan. "Taking on all that responsibility, and Lily. Oh, she's a darling. I've seen her out there with her rabbit. Just precious." Ethan's jaw tightened briefly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Then he rubbed the back of his neck, his voice softening as he replied, "Well, it's not exactly easy, but she's worth it." Alice glanced at him, surprised by the faint vulnerability in his tone. She hadn't known him long, but in that moment she could see the weight he carried, one she recognized too well. Loss had a way of settling into your bones, heavy and unyielding. Mrs. Wainwright clucked sympathetically. "Oh, I can only imagine. But you're doing a fine job, Ethan. A fine job indeed." She turned back to Alice, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "And I keep telling Alice she should join us for coffee sometime. Wouldn't that be nice?" "I don't drink coffee," Alice said quickly, the words sharper than she intended. Ethan chuckled softly, a low sound that caught her off guard. "Mrs. Wainwright, I think Alice prefers her peace and quiet." Mrs. Wainwright shook her head, unfazed. "Oh, nonsense. Everyone needs a little company now and then." Alice forced a polite smile, her discomfort growing. "I should get these flowers in water. Thank you, Mrs. Wainwright." "Ethan?" Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment, before he turned and continued toward his house. Alice placed the basket of flowers on her kitchen counter, staring at the vibrant petals that felt out of place in her muted home. Mrs. Wainwright's words echoed in her mind, uninvited. Losing his brother and sister-in-law like that. It was the kind of loss you didn't recover from. You simply learned to live with it. She had learned that lesson too many times. The day her father didn't come home, the quiet dinner table, her mother's departure with promises that felt hollow even if they weren't meant to be. And later, the long, slow grief of miscarriages that had hollowed out her marriage. James had tried to be patient, but even he couldn't hold them together under the weight of everything they'd lost. Loss, Alice thought bitterly, was her inheritance. Parents, children, husbands, they all slipped away one way or another, leaving a void that no amount of work or solitude could fill. And Lily. The little girl's laugh came back to her, bright and full of life. Alice had avoided children for years. Seeing them in parks, in strollers, had been like a knife twisting in a wound that never quite healed. But Lily was different. She wasn't a stranger in a store or a fleeting figure on a playground. She was a child marked by loss, one who had somehow managed to hold on to her light despite everything. And in that moment, Alice felt something other than bitterness at the thought of a child. It wasn't hope, it was something quieter, heavier, protective. She shook her head sharply, turning away from the flowers on the counter. Curiosity was dangerous, she reminded herself. It led to involvement, to vulnerability, to cracks in the walls she had worked so hard to build. Ethan and Lily weren't her problem, but as she turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Lily's laugh lingered in her mind, mingling with the faint memory of her aunt's voice, a reminder that some cracks, no matter how small, were impossible to ignore. A few days later, as Alice stepped off her porch in the morning, she spotted the little girl sitting cross-legged on Ethan's lawn, something black and sleek perched on her lap. Her breath caught. It was Willow. Alice frowned, her pace quickening as concern prickled in her chest. Willow didn't like people, not neighbours, not delivery drivers, and certainly not the small grabby hands of children. The girl giggled, her tiny fingers stroking Willow's glossy fur. Willow inexplicably seemed relaxed, her green eyes half closed as she accepted the attention. But Alice didn't trust it. A startled or irritated Willow could swipe in an instant, and the thought of the little girl getting scratched made her stomach clench. "I wouldn't—" Her words caught the attention of both Ethan and the little girl. Ethan, who had been crouched nearby, straightened, his expression shifting to mild concern. The girl looked up with wide, curious eyes, her hands pausing mid-stroke on Willow's back. "It's just, she doesn't usually like people," Alice said, her voice softer now but still tinged with worry. Ethan's brows lifted slightly, the corner of his mouth curving into a faint smile. "They say animals take after their owners," he said casually. "I have a feeling you keep to yourself but don't bite. Or am I wrong?" Alice blinked, unsure whether to bristle or laugh. She chose neither, her gaze flicking back to Willow, who was now purring softly under the little girl's touch. It was surreal to see Willow, her fiercely independent, aloof companion, completely at ease with the little girl. Alice cleared her throat, crouching slightly to get a better look. "What's your name?" she asked, directing her question toward the child. "Lily," the girl said softly, her voice shy but steady. "Hi, Lily. This is Willow." Lily beamed, her small hands continuing their careful strokes down Willow's back. "Willow likes me," she said, with the kind of confidence only a child could muster. Alice couldn't help the faint curve of her own lips. She is, and very picky about who she likes. Alice glanced at the cat, who was now stretching lazily on Lily's lap. "It seems she does," she murmured, still half disbelieving. Ethan crouched again, his expression warm but curious, as he watched the interaction. "You haven't introduced yourself," he said lightly, his gaze meeting Alice's. She hesitated. "I'm Alice," she said finally, her voice quieter than she expected. "Nice to finally meet you, Lily." For a moment, the three of them sat in a kind of unspoken ease, the soft sound of Willow's purring filling the quiet. Alice hadn't been this nice to someone in a long time. It felt strange, foreign, but not entirely unwelcome. She glanced at Ethan, who was now scratching the back of his neck, a faintly amused look on his face. She remembered their first real conversation, when he had knocked on her door that December, his first Christmas in the neighbourhood last year. "I noticed you don't have any lights or decorations," he'd said. "Thought I'd offer to help. I've got extra lights in the garage if you want them." Her response had been sharper than it needed to be. "I'm not interested in Christmas decorations." She hadn't meant to sound rude, but he hadn't seemed bothered. He'd simply shrugged, his smile easy. "Fair enough," he'd said. "But if you change your mind, let me know." And then he had left, hands in his pockets, his respect for her space clear. He hadn't approached her again after that, not until Mrs. Wainwright had roped them into the same conversation a few days ago. Alice shook the memory away, standing and brushing off her knees. Ethan gave her a look, half amused, half thoughtful. "She doesn't bite after all," he said with a smirk. Alice rolled her eyes faintly, but didn't respond. Instead, she gave Willow one last glance and nodded toward Lily. "Take good care of her," she said. "We will," Lily replied earnestly, her hand still stroking the cat. And as Alice walked to her car, she realized she was smiling, a small quiet smile that lingered, much to her own surprise. Alice hadn't planned on talking to anyone that morning, least of all her neighbour and his niece. But as she drove away, the image of Lily's small hand stroking Willow's fur and Ethan's easy smile stayed with her. For the first time, Alice wondered if keeping people at a distance had cost her more than she was willing to admit.